The Deadly Fern, a botanical horror. Section 1. A Curious Discovery. Professor Elmwood Augustine adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the dense foliage with a mix of curiosity and caution. Sunlight dappled the forest floor, illuminating patches of emerald green and casting intricate shadows. Beside him, his wife, Eleanor, gasped in astonishment. Mrs. Augustine as Eleanor. "Elmwood, look over there!" He turned, following her gaze with a sense of anticipation. There, nestled amongst the familiar ferns and vines, was a plant neither of them recognized, standing out like a hidden gem. It was a fern, but unlike any they had ever seen in their years of exploration. Its fronds were a deep, almost black green, and they shimmered with an unnatural iridescence, catching the light in a mesmerizing way. Eleanor, an avid gardener with a keen eye for the extraordinary, was immediately captivated by its beauty. "Mrs. Augustine," as Eleanor, "it's magnificent. We must take a cutting. Imagine this thriving in our conservatory. It would be the crown jewel of our collection." Elmwood, ever the cautious academic, felt a prickle of unease, sensing that this discovery might be more than it seemed. "Professor Elmwood Augustine, perhaps we should identify it first, my dear. We don't know what it is or if it's safe," but Eleanor was already reaching for her gardening shears, her excitement overriding any caution. Section 2, Ferneus, shows its true colors. In the heart of the dense forest, the mysterious fern known as Ferneus began to reveal its secrets. The shears snipped, severing a single frond with a crisp, decisive sound that echoed through the still air. At the precise moment the frond fell away from the main plant, a low growl seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as if the very ground was alive and reacting to the disturbance. Eleanor gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. From the severed end of the fern a thick, viscous sap began to ooze, pulsing slowly like a beating heart, each drop shimmering in the dim light. The air grew heavy, thick with the cloying sweetness of overripe fruit and something else, something metallic and sharp, a scent that seemed to cut through the sweetness like a knife. Eleanor swayed, her eyes wide with alarm, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the strange scent filled her lungs. "Mrs. Augustine," as Eleanor. "Elmwood, I don't feel well." Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear and confusion. She whispered, her hand flying to her throat as if trying to grasp the source of her sudden discomfort. But before Elmwood could reach her, she crumpled to the ground, a thin stream of the glistening sap creeping towards her like a venomous serpent, its movement deliberate and menacing, as if it had a mind of its own. Session 3, The Professor's Grief. Elmwood knelt beside his wife, his heart a lead weight in his chest. Her skin, where the sap had touched her, was already turning a sickly green, the veins beneath standing out in stark relief. He shook her gently, his voice hoarse with terror. The once vibrant and lively Eleanor was now a mere shadow of herself, her life force ebbing away with each passing second. Elmwood's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to reverse the damage, but he knew it was too late. Professor Elmwood Augustine. Eleanor, speak to me, please, don't leave me." His voice cracked, filled with desperation and sorrow, echoing through the silent garden. But Eleanor remained still, her eyes staring up at the canopy of leaves overhead. The vibrant life that had always shone so brightly within her was gone, extinguished in a matter of moments. The strange, iridescent fern stood silently nearby, its deadly sap no longer flowing. It looked almost innocent, but Elmwood knew better. This plant, this botanical anomaly, had robbed him of his beloved wife. The garden, once a place of joy and discovery, now felt like a tomb, a cruel reminder of the price of his curiosity. Elmwood's grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sorrow that threatened to consume him entirely. Panic gave way to a steely resolve. He would find out what this plant was, and he would ensure no one else suffered the same fate as Eleanor. Scooping up his wife's lifeless hand one last time, he stood, his eyes burning with unshed tears. He knew who to call, the Horticultural Society, renowned for their knowledge of rare and exotic plants. Surely they would have answers. Hurriedly, he made his way back through the woods, the image of Eleanor's lifeless face etched permanently in his mind. He would not rest until he understood the tragedy that had befallen them. The news of Eleanor's bizarre death reached Professor Augustine's old acquaintance, Dr. Theodore Harrow, a leading botanist at the Horticultural Society. Intrigued and horrified in equal measure, Dr. Harrow arrived at the scene within hours, his brow furrowed with concern. Elmwood, his face etched with grief, led him to the clearing. The fern stood undisturbed, its iridescent fronds swaying slightly in the breeze. Dr. Harrow approached it cautiously, examining it with a practiced eye.
Curious, he murmured, his fingers hovering over the plant but not daring to touch it. He had never encountered anything like it before.
Dr. Harrow turned, his gaze falling upon Eleanor's body, now covered by a white sheet. Elmwood, misinterpreting his gaze, choked back a sob.
That plant, it took her from me.
Dr. Harrow frowned, a wave of sympathy washing over him. He placed a comforting hand on Elmwood's shoulder.
Professor, I understand your grief, but I assure you, this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. There must be a logical explanation.
Elmwood, consumed by grief and suspicion, saw only a callous dismissal of his wife's death.
Logical explanation, he spat, his voice thick with anger. She was fine until she touched that thing.
The misunderstanding, fueled by grief and the shock of the situation, solidified into a seed of suspicion in Elmwood's heart. The following days passed in a blur of grief and arrangements. Dr. Harrow, ever the scientist, took samples of the fern, promising Elmwood answers. He insisted on a thorough analysis, convinced that the plant held the key to understanding Eleanor's demise. Elmwood, however, found little solace in the botanist's assurances. He haunted the halls of his home, his heart heavy with loss. Eleanor's laughter, her vibrant presence, seemed to linger in every corner, a constant reminder of his tragic loss. He threw himself into his work, seeking refuge in the familiar world of academia, but even the most intricate equations and theories couldn't distract him from the gaping hole in his life. One evening, as Elmwood sat alone in his study, a cold draught caused the window curtains to billow inwards. He shivered, suddenly aware of the oppressive silence that had settled over the house. He missed Eleanor's cheerful humming, the gentle clinking of teacups as she prepared their evening tea. He rose to close the window when a flash of movement outside caught his eye. A shiver ran down his spine. There, on the lawn, bathed in the pale moonlight, stood the silhouette of Dr. Harrow. But what sent a jolt of terror through him was the sight of the fern, seemingly uprooted, being carried in Dr. Harrow's arms. Why was he taking the plant? Elmwood's blood ran cold. As Elmwood watched, Dr. Harrow approached the house, his shadow stretching long and distorted in the moonlight. He stopped at the front door, fumbling in his coat pocket for a key. Elmwood's mind raced, his suspicions returning with renewed force. He had misjudged Dr. Harrow, he realized now. The botanist wasn't interested in helping. He was here to silence him, to cover up the truth about the deadly fern. Panic clawed at his throat. He had to escape. But as he turned towards the back door, he heard the distinct click of the lock disengaging. He was trapped. But as he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the fern in his arms stirred. Its fronds unfurled, revealing rows of razor-sharp thorns. Before Dr. Harrow could react, the thorns shot out, piercing his skin with deadly accuracy. A startled cry escaped his lips as the same viscous sap that had claimed Eleanor's life began to flow from the wounds. The fern pulsed with an eerie light, its fronds coiling around Dr. Harrow's body like constricting snakes. Elmwood watched in horror as the true nature of the plant was revealed. It wasn't Dr. Harrow who had been the threat all along, it was the fern, a silent, deadly predator masquerading as an innocent plant. As Dr. Harrow's struggles ceased and the eerie glow of the fern subsided, Elmwood felt a surge of adrenaline. He had to act fast. Grabbing a heavy fire iron from the fireplace, he crept towards the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised the iron high above his head, his gaze fixed on the pulsating plant. This creature, this botanical aberration, had taken everything from him. As he brought the iron down with all his might, a single thought echoed in his mind. He would make sure it claimed no more victims. Whether he could defeat it remained to be seen, but Elmwood Augustine would face this terrifying enemy head-on, fueled by grief and a burning desire for vengeance.
Harry Goldbean here, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching. This has been an alternate version of the Monsterous Fern. To see the full version, please consider donating to my Zelle so that I might be able to purchase the app necessary to complete the process of publishing the full edition. Thank you for watching, and have a great, fun, adventure-filled life. Enjoy.